2015, the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, I rise to have a discussion with my fellow colleagues and with those people throughout the United States who are watching this and reading this in the congressional record. The issue I wish to discuss is a matter of grave concern to me and I believe to the American people as well. I came here 26 years ago. I had served 7 years prior to my arrival here in the United States Congress. I served for 7 years in the Reagan White House. I was a speechwriter to President Reagan, and I was a special assistant to the President, which is a designated rank at the White House. I recall what it was like in the time leading up to Ronald Reagan's election, and I recall specifically how Ronald Reagan dealt with the great challenges he faced. Before Ronald Reagan came to the White House, America was in retreat. There was a sense of pessimism throughout our country. Our economy was topsy-turvy, high levels of inflation, high levels of unemployment, and our country was in jeopardy. Our country felt a danger because while we were in retreat, communism, Soviet communism, was on the offensive throughout the world. Well, Ronald Reagan, in 8 short years, turned that situation totally around. Turned an economy around, turned around a spirit of the people. We went from pessimistic to being the most optimistic and forward-looking people in the world. But first and foremost, Ronald Reagan, he did, yes, help the economy, but he ended the Cold War. During my life, I'm 67 years old, and during my life, most of us felt that someday we would be at war with the Soviet Union, a shooting war, that it might take the lives of millions of people. We were told to hide under our desk when we were young and cover up our heads in case there was a nuclear attack on our country. Ronald Reagan expanded the United States military. And many times people, when they look back and they understand the success that we had in ending the Cold War, they believe that it was due to the increase in the size of our military. Let me note that did play a factor because it was a deterrent factor, and it was a factor that awed many people in the developing world as well as our enemies in the communist world. But that's not what changed our retreat in the Cold War to a great victory and the bringing down of the Berlin Wall. What changed it was a change in strategy that Ronald Reagan initiated during the time that he was president. He was a strong leader, and when he came into the White House and people asked, what is your strategy for dealing with the Soviet threat to our freedom and the peace of the world? And he said, the strategy is very simple. We win and they lose. And that's what he set out, and that was the guidelines that he set out for us who worked for him in the White House and throughout the administration. Of that, our goal was to be that the United States would win the Cold War and the Soviet Union would lose. Well, during that time period, Ronald Reagan did not deploy American troops overseas like people think that he did. Yes, he expanded our military power, but he made very few deployments, major deployments of American troops. And in fact, in one deployment, which he made to Beirut, where he sent thousands of Marines to Beirut, I personally was arguing against it in the White House and went around finding out what it was all about. And after a few short weeks, it turned into a fiasco. It turned into a situation, a tragedy as well as a fiasco, I might add. 300 Americans, Marines and sailors, lost their lives when their headquarters was blown up. Their bunker, you might say, their barracks in Beirut was blown up. Ronald Reagan's advisors at that time advised him to send in tens of thousands of more American troopers, send in the entire 2nd Marine Division, and show these terrorists they can't kill Marines and get away with it. Ronald Reagan made his best decision as president at that time not to make such a huge, major deployment of troops into Beirut. Otherwise, we would have been in a quagmire for the rest of his administration. They would have been there, stuck in this war zone in Beirut, a no-win situation. Reagan knew that. But he knew that also when he told her, he says, no, we're going to get out of there as soon as we can, rather than get stuck in the quagmire. He initiated another policy, a security policy, based on a different doctrine than sending American troops to garrison in the world or sending American troops to fight other people's battles. And what it was is Ronald Reagan initiated the Reagan Doctrine. The Reagan Doctrine was basically to recognize that the enemy of our enemy was our friend, and to do everything we could to identify our friends around the world who would help us defeat the Soviet Union. The Reagan Doctrine had us helping people in Nicaragua who were fighting against the Sandinista dictatorship, which was allied with the Soviet Union. It was in Africa, where you had Cuban troops being confronted by insurgency movements that we supported that were pro-democracy or at least anti-Soviet, and in Afghanistan, where the Soviet army itself was being confronted. Ronald Reagan, as part of a doctrine to support those who were struggling for freedom against oppression, we helped people in Europe, the Lech Wałęsas and the various leaders throughout Eastern Europe who organized resistance against the Soviet domination of their countries, whether it be Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary. They received covert support from President Reagan. Reagan wanted, yes, to defeat the Soviet Union, and that's what we did. We did it in a way by helping those who were on the front lines, struggling against what we saw as an evil. That is, a government in Russia that was controlled by an atheistic theory that atheist dictatorship imposed upon people could reestablish new values among human beings and thus create a whole new world. That monstrous philosophy, that had been monstrous because it had monstrous implications in terms of human freedom, but also in the control and slaughter of those people who did not agree with that vision. That had to be defeated because it threatened the entire world. And by the time Ronald Reagan was finished with his presidency and the leadership that he provided to the free world and all those who were struggling against communism, we succeeded. The Berlin Wall came down. This was done because of great leadership and a great strategy on the part of this man. Today, we look at a totally different world than the world that Reagan left us. Reagan left us a world, unlike the world that he inherited from his predecessor, President Carter. We left us a world where the upward trend towards our civilization was undeniable. That there looked like we could have generations of peace, and that our enemies respected us to the point that they would not put us in jeopardy because it would be putting themselves in jeopardy. Reagan gave us chances for peace and prosperity and freedom throughout the world. Today, we face a totally different world. It's a frightening world. And we have today an adversary that is every bit as evil and potentially harmful and destructive to the people of the world as what we faced when Ronald Reagan came to the presidency at the height of the Cold War. Yes, everything was dangerous at that time, and Reagan gave us peace and security. Today, we are facing evil and danger as even before when the Cold War, but perhaps we could compare this even to the evil and danger that America and the Western world faced in the early 30s and the late 20s, when Nazism and fascism raised its ugly head. And what happened? During that time period, had we been able to deal, and the Western Allies deal with Adolf Hitler, perhaps there would not have been this huge conflagration of World War II, which took the lives of hundreds of millions of people. But they did not deal with that, as Ronald Reagan dealt with communism when he became president, and Hitler and the fascist threat, eventually with their aggression, put the free world and those other people who sought a better world at such a spot that war was erupted, and World War II, that great conflagration, happened. It was avoidable. Well, today we face a similar threat. We face an evil that, as I say, is every bit as dangerous as evil as what was faced by Reagan and faced before World War II. It's a radical Islamic philosophy that will slaughter people in the West without thinking twice about it. What's even worse is slaughter people in great numbers in the West after strategizing of how to do it more effectively. Not only slaughtering Christians and other non-Muslims, but this evil force is seeking to dominate that part of the world in which the majority of people are of the Islamic faith. This evil, radical Islamic terrorist evil murders more Muslims than indeed than they murder Christians, although they have been very aggressive in their murder of Christians in a very demonstrable way, in a way that would try to intimidate the Christian world and the non-Muslim world. But we have brave and courageous people within the Muslim world. We must not let ourselves be brought to the point that the radical Islamic movement wants us to be in, and that is to alienate the rest of the billion Muslims who occupy this planet and make them our enemy. Like Ronald Reagan, we must seek out our friends throughout the world who are struggling against radical Islamic terrorism and dictatorship, and make sure that we back them up so they will have a chance to defeat this threat and this ongoing murder and chaos that's engulfing their own countries. Today we have such heroes overseas, but let us note in the last 6 years, this threat has grown, has gone from minuscule to being a threat that could, if we do not deal with it, could erupt into the same type of global conflagration that we saw in World War II, and perhaps, or at the best, would leave us with a war, with a global split in the world like happened under communism that we defeated under Ronald Reagan. Yes, we could see if this threat of radical Islam is not confronted with American leadership, 10 years down the road, there could be a massive conflagration that would encompass, for example, what would happen if we do lose total control and things go totally out of control in the Gulf areas, in the Persian Gulf, and in the Arab world. If that part of the world becomes the dominant force in that part of the world becomes this radical Islamic philosophy, it will then move to the stands. It will then move to the great parts of Africa and of Central Asia that will tip the balance of power in this planet and will lead to the type of global conflagration that all of us want to avoid and to prevent. But we must have the type of decisive leadership and the type of actual commitment to winning this battle against the radical Islamic dictatorship that these people are trying to superimpose upon the world. We need the strong commitment that we saw under Ronald Reagan. We need that, and we do not have it. We do not have the leadership we need, or the type of chaos that is now erupting in the Arab world would not be happening. What's happening in this chaos that we see, this rise of ISIL, a group of people that are so committed to establishing a Muslim dictatorship throughout their part of the world and throughout Africa, and yes, even throughout the rest of the world where other non-Muslim communities live. These people are dedicated to terrorizing the world into, excuse me, into submission to their authority, and they see their authority as coming from their radical version of God through their radical version of Islam. Again, most Muslims deny and reject that type of Islam. But let us not forget, let us not ignore the fact that this radical philosophy is based on their interpretation of Islam, that it is a religious fanaticism that could, just like communism was a religious fanaticism, it was an atheist fanaticism. And we have seen Christian fanaticisms in the past. And they did great damage and caused the lives of huge numbers of people in their day. This radical Islamic fanaticism will, maybe perhaps, unless we defeat it now, will perhaps drag the entire planet into a World War II-like conflagration. So how do we stop that? How was Ronald Reagan able to stop the rise, the communism, the Soviet expansionism that he faced when he took office, and in 7 or 8 short years managed to turn that around and defeat that very enemy? Well, first he had the commitment to defeat it. And I will say that today I do not believe that our president has the commitment to defeat and destroy radical Islamic terrorism and the radical Islamic dictatorship that these fanatics would superimpose on us. Instead, I think our president believes in all good faith that he can reach an accommodation with these folks, with these fanatics, that an accommodation can be reached, and that we should try to show them that, prove to them that we are not their enemy. Well, they know they're our enemy because they get their word from God, not from the President of the United States. That's what they believe. And they see these overtures to fanatic radicals like in the Taliban. They see that as weakness. And it only encourages the radical Islamic movement for our president to try to reach accommodation or to say pleasant things to them without being aggressive, without being a commit, with seeming to be unwilling to actually draw a line in the sand. Our president, as most people know, has trouble even uttering the words Islamic terrorism in one sentence. We are not going to be successful in defeating this threat that would murder us by the millions of people if they get the chance, if our president is not even willing to utter the words Islamic terrorism in the same sentence. We have a president that after our ambassador was murdered in Benghazi, tried to foist off on the American people the false story that our ambassador was killed because a demonstration against a movie that insulted Islam got out of control and the demonstrators killed our ambassador. For weeks, this president himself participated in spreading that lie. Now, what message did it give us? First of all, now, my gosh, our president isn't going to tell us the truth about radical Islam. But what did the Muslim terrorists think? At that moment, the Muslim terrorists were thinking, my goodness, we have a guy who's so weak that he can't even condemn us and condemn the killing of his own ambassador by our movement. This emboldened them, and that's why, and also we heard early on, of course, support for various quote, reform movements, and we all hoped that the Arab Spring would be a reform movement. But instead, our president, unlike Ronald Reagan, who sought out to help those people who were the most aggressive opponents of Soviet communism. This president has tried to seek out those people in the Muslim Brotherhood and elsewhere and reach an accommodation with them. That is why today we see an enormous chaos and the rise of a radical fanatic Islamic movement, ISIL, that will burn people alive, that will recruit people throughout the West to murder people in a newspaper, like we just saw in Paris for drawing a cartoon that in some way made fun of their beliefs, as if people can't make fun, people aren't free to make fun of other people's beliefs. No, they think it's all right to murder those people, and that is less sinful. That's not even a sin, that's a mandate as compared to murdering unarmed people. An unarmed cartoonist, newspaper cartoonist in France, and his colleagues, a policeman who happened to be a Muslim, laying there helpless on the ground, and they murdered him outright. This is fanaticism. This is part of a movement, a fanatic Islamic movement that has to be stopped, because they will not stop at killing one policeman who happens to be a Muslim on the ground. They will murder millions of Americans and millions of others if they get their chance. And they are trying to establish themselves throughout the Arab world right now. We need to make sure we stand by our friends. Yet, unlike Ronald Reagan, there was no doubt that he was standing behind our friends who opposed Soviet communism. But how are we? What are we projecting to those people who are standing firm against this fanatic, radical Islamic movement that would put Islamic dictatorship on the people? What are we telling? What are we telling our friends who are standing up against that? Well, how about General Sisi, now President Sisi, el-Sisi of Egypt? El-Sisi was a general who stepped in at a time when Egypt could have gone either way. We had a radical Islamic movement going there. Yes, there was an elected president, and he broke his word to his own people of trying to institute a caliphate in Egypt, and they rose up against him in an aggressive shout from the people of Egypt, saying we will not let our country become an Islamic caliphate. This is Egypt. We believe in a democratic government here, and we believe in an Egyptian government, not some radical fanatic Arab government that was superimposed on them by members of some Muslim Brotherhood that operates behind the scenes. Well, we almost lost Egypt. And if Egypt would fall today, or would have fallen then, there would be no chance of stopping this fanatic movement that threatens the world and threatens especially other Muslim countries. There would have been no chance at all. President el-Sisi is a courageous man who has stepped forward, and our president took a long time and is still taking a long time in getting solidly behind the effort to prevent Egypt from becoming a bastion of fanatic Islamic radicalism that would threaten the world. General Sisi needs, for example, I visited him a year ago. They expressed, my goodness, why we bought all these helicopters from the United States, and we need them now because there's an insurgency going on with the radicals out in the Sinai Desert. We need these helicopters, and it took forever for our administration, for this government, to provide the spare parts for that effort. They had to jump through hoops. We were doing them a favor. No, we should look at these people as doing us a favor. They are on the front lines battling this. And General Sisi just recently did something that all Americans and free and peace-loving people throughout the world should applaud. And that is, he went directly to Muslim groups in Egypt and spoke to them and spoke on the record saying, we have got to cleanse ourselves from this fanaticism in which we are intolerant of other people's religions. These people who would murder other people and commit acts of terrorism. Now President el-Sisi, that was courageous of him. We need other leaders to follow in his footsteps. Has our administration done anything to congratulate General and now President el-Sisi in making that incredible stand that we want him to make? What type of things have we done to prove that we now are behind him in this effort? He also did something else. President el-Sisi, the first president of Egypt ever to visit a Coptic church, the Christian church in Egypt. Yet, this administration has been just so-so when it comes to Sisi. There's no, yes, we have not undermined him, but we have not given the support which would have been a signal to all the other leaders there to stand firm, and America will stand behind you. We have people like, for example, the king of Jordan, who was only here just a few days ago, and what happened? A Jordanian pilot was put into a cage and burned to death as a public spectacle. A Jordanian pilot. Why did they do that? Why did these fanatics do that? Because they meant to terrorize the people of the world, terrorize the people of Africa, terrorize other people who would stand up against them. And what was Abdullah's reaction to that? He left his meetings in the United States and flew back to Jordan, and it is now being said that he personally flew a bombing mission against the ISIL people that had burned that man alive. Now there's a leader, and we should be backing him up. But then what do we hear just in the paper the other day? That Jordan is having difficulty in getting the supplies of weapons and arms they need to make sure that they can stand firm against ISIL and this horrible radical fanatic movement that's sweeping through their part of the world. That's Ronald Reagan knew that we needed to support great leaders who would help us end the Cold War. We will bring about war if the leaders like Abdullah, King Abdullah in Jordan, or and now President el-Sisi in Egypt, people don't know, we won't get behind them. How can we count on others to take that stand? How about the Kurds up in northern Iraq? They are the ones bearing the burden, bearing the brunt of all of the fighting that's going on now in Iraq. Our other people, when we tried to work things through Baghdad and tried to accommodate leaders who were half-heartedly in this battle and really weren't committed, what happened? We gave them enormous amounts of military equipment that ended up in the hands of the radicals, ended up being used as vehicles and guns to destroy and kill people who want the type of world that we want to live in, which is a world of tolerance and freedom and peace and prosperity, not radical, fanatic Muslim dictatorship, but instead the Kurds stood firm. The Kurds are the one group in Iraq that have stood firm and have the one group that has received the least support from the United States as compared to the others. And we are now, the Baghdad, which wants to put their thumb down on the Kurds, we are going along with the demand with those people that all our aid that goes to the Kurds goes to Baghdad first. That means recognizing the people who are not really on our side, their power over the people who are on our side. In fact, there was a meeting in London just in the last few days, I guess it was last week, to determine what would go on in Iraq. The United States was, of course, maybe not sitting at the table, but helped organize this, and we're part of the process of trying to get this meeting together. We didn't even insist that the Kurds were there. The Kurds weren't even at the table. This was a betrayal of the people who are on the front lines fighting the big fight of today against radical Islamic terrorism. We betrayed them. This is horrible. What kind of message does that send to other people around the world who have to stand up against this onslaught of radical, fanatic Islamic terrorist and dictatorship that would be superimposed on them? We've got to make sure that these people understand, whether it's Abdullah or the crown, or how about the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, for example. Here's a man who's so strong in his conviction and leadership in that part of the world to try to stop this terrible threat. But yet, we don't, yes, he's treated well. We should be honoring him. Our administration should be leading the efforts to take the Abdullahs and the Crown Prince there in Abu Dhabi and President Ali Sisi. These people deserve a demonstrable support, not just okay, not just sort of half-heartedly getting behind them. And what about, for example, even Qatar today? Qatar is trying to make its decision as what to do in the face of this. And they permit us, for example, to have airstrikes against ISIL, this radical Islamic group up in Iraq. They are permitting us to use their base for those an airbase in Qatar to launch those attacks. Well, we should make sure people understand that and are grateful to them for it and be demonstrable about it. And part of it is being, yes, stand up with your friends. Somebody does something good like Qatar has just done and wants to go back, and by the way, has taken some steps in the right direction after taking some steps in the wrong direction in a couple of years. They lost faith in us, I believe, and now they're coming back in our direction. We should encourage that. But we also need, the other half of the equation is, we need to be tough on the guys who are our enemies, who are going the wrong way, who are supporting radical Islamic fanatic terrorism. Like, for example, Pakistan. We are still giving billions of dollars over a 10-year period to Pakistan. We're giving hundreds of millions of dollars of military equipment and foreign aid to a country that is, yes, supporting the Taliban. Almost all of the people who we have lost in Afghanistan can be traced back to terrorists who are using Pakistan as a home base. But not only as a home base, the ISI have been actively involved with helping these fanatic terrorists that our people were up against in Afghanistan. How do we know that? Well, we do know that it's known, but maybe just the fact that they were giving safe haven to Osama bin Laden, the murderer of 3,000 Americans on 9/11. They gave safe haven to this man. They're trying to say, oh, we didn't know. No one believes that. They knew, and now, to adding insult to injury, they've taken the doctor who gave us the location of Osama bin Laden and helped us bring Osama bin Laden to justice. That doctor, Dr. Afridi, is now languishing in a dungeon, in a 10 by 10 foot cell in Pakistan. That act by Pakistan is a hostile act to the United States. And for us to walk away and ignore it is to encourage others to treat us in the same way. We must be tough on our enemies and friends to our friends. Or is that a difficult formula? Is that too difficult for people to understand? We are losing today because I believe this president has been treating our enemies better than he's been treating our friends in many cases in terms of willing to reach out to them. We should be reaching out and trying to do everything we can to help the friendly countries rather than reaching out to seek accommodations with these evil countries. Nowhere is that, by the way, better demonstrated than the announcement that we had secretly negotiated a deal with Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. Secretly negotiated. Congress didn't know what was going on, and now he has announced by edict, there's executive orders. Here's a president, maybe he likes Castro a little bit because Castro, after all, he could rule with edicts. Just like our president now wants to rule with edicts rather than go through what we call your regular order as seeking the legislative branch and seeking compromises and establishing policy in that way. Instead, this president reversed 50 years of American policy towards Cuba on his own, rather than coming here to Congress and working out something with us and trying to find what was the best way, and opening up Cuba to having a beginning of an economic relationship and having Americans to go freely there and them to come to the United States. Well, he did that, and there were no concessions, none, that the Cubans made for this president to give up that 50 years of this is what our policy is, you're going to have to do this, then free elections, opposition parties, etc., then we will recognize you. This president gave it up and no concessions on the other side. Now, by the way, what message does that send to all these other countries? So again, it's not just Cuba. What message does that send to all these other countries when we complain about human rights, or we try to set a standard, some standard, that will indeed take that country in the right direction? No, we end up giving up a 50-year policy with no concessions. Thus, every little petty dictator in the world, or even worse, every group that's out there who's trying to decide whether or not to go with radical Islamic terrorism or not, they know they can make whatever decision they want, and eventually the United States is going to cave in because we are projecting weakness. As I say, the one thing Ronald Reagan did that was terrific was to rebuild our military, and it did. It created a sense of awe, but it was a sense of strength. He used that sense of strength, but it was his strategy in helping those people throughout the world who were our friends and the friends of the things we believed in and the enemy of our enemies. That's what worked. We are sending the wrong message to the people who will be the enemy of our enemies. We are undermining by not providing positive and forceful support for those people who are standing up, where the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and these others, and Abdullah in Jordan and President El-Sisi in Egypt. By not demonstrably standing with them, we send the wrong message throughout the world. That's why things are falling apart. That's why things are not going in the right direction. This isn't, we just happen to live in a time when things are chaotic. That is not the case. Just like Ronald Reagan just didn't live in the times when there was a Soviet communist threat that was undermining the peace of the world. That didn't just happen. It was the basis of things that we did, yes, what they did, but also our response to that threat. Today, this administration, I believe, has led us down a path that has created the chaos that we now see, created a situation where you have a radical, fanatic Islamic dictatorship movement that not only tries to take over and dominate the Islamic part of the world, but is threatening terrorist acts and is engaged in terrorist acts. We will have more and more bombings like we saw at the Boston Marathon. We will have more and more terrorist actions taken in Western Europe, as we saw in Paris, or in Africa, unless we step forward and let the world know that we are strong in our commitment, and we stand by those who will help us in this battle. I visited recently New York City, and I had not been there since for a long time, and I had never gone to the 9/11 Memorial. I visited the 9/11 Memorial, and I would advise anyone who has not been there to go there. This is a memorial to the 3,000 Americans who died on 9/11, and most of them there at the World Trade Center and those two great towers that were brought down on that day. And you should go. Anyone hearing my voice, my colleagues, others should go and see this. They have managed to get a picture of almost every one of the victims who died that day. Many, of course, were firemen and policemen who, when the airplane struck that building, instead of running away and rushing away, they ran towards the building. They ran there to see what they could do to help, and they gave their lives. These heroic people. We have to have a government as heroic as our own people if we are going to triumph over the evil that slaughtered those people today. They slaughtered them in 9/11, and they will slaughter them today. And I looked at those pictures of those 3,000 people, and I was in the government when that happened. I was in, and I worked with Reagan, and before that, but in 9/11, we had been here a long time, and we're all part of this. We owe it to the people of the United States, all of us, on both sides of the aisle and in the executive branch, and whoever is who is the government of this country. We owe it to our people to make sure we are doing the right thing. And I looked into their faces, and I brought my children with me to see this. And I said, look, all of those people, you know what they're telling us? They're telling us, to me, and to all of us here in this body, you let us down. You let us down. Don't do it again. Don't let there be another wall in another city with 20,000 pictures on it because they got some sort of dirty bomb or something. These people that we're facing today are capable of that. I am not arguing for major deployments of military units overseas, occupation, garrisoning the world like we did and so for too long. And I do not think it was right for us to go into Iraq in the first place. But I do argue that when we find people on our side, like Ronald Reagan did, we need to have a strong military, and we need to make sure that the world respects us, but then we need to have stands and activities and actions that win their respect. Them knowing that we stand with those people who will stand firm against this threat to the world. Otherwise, someday, we will. There could be another World War II-like thing 10 years down the road when we say, why didn't you stop that fanatic Hitler when he was just walking around, goose-stepping around in these towns in Germany when he could have been stopped? Why didn't you stop him then? No, then there was hundreds of millions of people. This could lead to that type of conflagration. But one thing we know, unless we stop this radical movement there now, they will find ways of killing thousands of Americans, and there will be other walls with other pictures saying, why didn't you do something? No, I call on my colleagues now to seriously look at this challenge that we face. I hope that those people, my negative comments about what I believe is the president not dealing with the situation in the right way is something that I'm saying from the heart, not saying I do not. I'm not doing this for political reasons. And let me just say, today we see examples where we need to make stands. We need to make sure, for example, the mullah regime in Iran is facing a president of the United States and an American government that's making demands that they do not use this system that they are developing now, that they have signed a treaty agreeing that they will not have a nuclear weapon. We should hold them to that treaty. And we should be helping the people in Iran who are struggling against that mullah regime. I don't say we should attack Iran with American military might. We should be supporting and should have done so all along. There were demonstrators in the streets of Tehran, and there was no message. There was no message at all of support from our government at that time. That was one of the first things this president did, is he refrained from helping and supporting those young activists for democracy in Iran. The Baluch people are fighting against the oppression of the Pakistani, the corruption and oppression of the Pakistani government, which is dominated by these radicals. We should be helping the Baluch, who can also be active in Iran, I might say. Well, there goes this. Anyway, there are options that we can have throughout the world today, actions, both in terms of policy and in terms of actually helping people struggle for freedom, that will ensure the peace of the world 10 years down the road. It will ensure that, as Ronald Reagan, when he took over, he left us a better world. We need to take the steps now to make sure that when we leave this body, when we leave Congress or leave whoever becomes president the next time around, that we leave that government, this government, and at a time when our people have a greater chance for freedom, a greater chance to live at peace. And we need to make sure that our people can live in peace and prosperity. Those pictures on the wall at the 9/11 memorial shout out to us. Do your duty. You didn't do it. You let us down. Don't do it again. Make sure the American people are safe. You have a challenge now. Meet that challenge. Stand firm. Stand strong behind those who are with you. I now yield back the balance of my time.
Under the Speaker's